Now we move on to Mr. Tushenko the Toy Maker. This is the longest children's story, and here is the little mock-up book which I go through in a separate video. I don't have Mr. Tushenko, or in fact the watchmaker as he really is called, in London, but I do have Joe the beggar boy, or sorry, Jim is his real name, and he's a little boy from the 30s. That's how I made him initially, but then when I enlisted him for this story, he became the beggar boy. I'm so sorry about the awful lighting. And I do have a character I considered being the narrator for the story, an old gent who appears on a bench at the beginning and the end of the story, and I just left him in the pictures as a sort of unvoiced device, or a possibility that we were witnessing it through his eyes, but in fact I didn't open the story and close it with him in the narrative. This Tudor house was made by the same couple that made the other dolls' houses, and it's one of the smallest houses. I think only Clara Kowalczyk's cottage in Little Old Lady Pie is smaller. And this little house was so versatile, it came in useful for at least 3 stories, and the rooms were made over so many times, and the removable front allowed me to suggest the building was twice as big as it was, or 2 separate buildings on other occasions. I mentioned before that these were detachable wooden bay windows that I placed up against the front of the house and photoshopped them to make it seem like they joined. In fact, it was just, the walls are just brick. I photoshopped the background black in order to hopefully suggest that they, the windows in fact faced on into the shop and there wasn't a wall behind them. This is an instance of how I used the front of the Tudor house. The front is usually here to suggest another whole building in the Dr. Gloucester scene from Where's My Story. And I used a similar setup, with the addition of Clara Kowalczyk's cottage to suggest a village scene in Mr. Tushenko the Toy Maker. There's the old man on the bench. I mentioned I considered having as the narrator or the storyteller. The problem is, in using the front here, it becomes obvious that this building does not have a front there, but I just hope that the viewer wouldn't notice too much. In fact, it should jut out like that. And I took a photo looking the other way with my camera here for one of the illustrations in Mr. Tushenko the Toy Maker. This is the little beggar boy running down the street crying after Mr. Tushenko has shouted at him. But I wasn't sure which way I was going to take the photo at this point. That's why I had a sort of screen or sky there. And you can see the background of the bedroom there. And I used the Tudor house again in the scrapwork field as a tea room, using the bay windows, putting bunting in the bay windows and cakes and sandwiches instead of toys. There's the upstairs of the tea rooms with Jess and Sylvie having afternoon tea. I think I called it Burley's Bakery. And this is the upstairs of the Tudor house. I realised I forgot to paint the ceiling later, but I photoshopped the difference, or I think I cut the photo off. This is Mr. Tushenko's bedroom. Looking through the lattice windows to Mr. Tushenko, a lamp giving the illusion of morning sunlight, and the same room as a tea room. There was always this room always had a stairs, but I covered up the stairs. I sawed off the top and covered the opening with floorboards for Mr. Tushenko's bedroom. You can actually see the little piece of wood there that I used to cover it. Here Sylvie and Meg having afternoon tea. Meg's straw, a little bit of wire twisted around a pin and painted red. And then the bay windows again, filled with cakes I made, and bunting and ribbon to suggest a bakery instead. And downstairs, Mr. Tushenko's toy shop with this is now the bakery, and here are the stairs coming down here. Through that door was Mr. Tushenko's workshop, but instead I'm suggesting that the bakery is through there, and this is the front of the shop. It says seating upstairs to the cafe, and here is the shop as it was in Mr. Tushenko the toy maker. And here are some more customers. I've actually got this model here in London with me. I call her Mrs. Partridge. She actually survived the whole the filming. I was going to say the filming process, but it sounds a bit pretentious. But she didn't get too damaged when I was taking photographs, thank goodness, because her dress was one of the most difficult I've ever made. Here's the storyteller again. I like to think that the reader might occur to the reader that he's been telling the story all along. And this little workshop here, the lean-to was Mr. Tushenko's workshop. So the toy shop is here, and then the door that led through to the back led through to this little building here. This is the front of the Tudor house again, and here I placed the bay windows to suggest the toy shop and the bakery. And I really like this image of Mr. Tushenko's now living quarters downstairs, because I changed it from a shop to living quarters. Here is a little battery operated, some coals in the fire. Oh, sorry. And through the door is his workshop again, that little lean-to I was just talking about. That light is a doll's house bulb placed behind some fake coals and cinders and a red plastic mould, which I cut in half to squeeze into the grate of a small cast iron kit stove I painted black. And the doll's house light was faint enough to give the impression of a fire in the gloom without lightening the darkness of this room too much. Here you can see all of the toys on the shelves, which I made at various points, and sometimes some of them I broke to suggest that they needed to be fixed. These are all part of the Up in the Nursery range. The doll he's holding here is this doll here. This is real sawdust. This is a real ball of, some stuffing or wool, and some rolls of paper to suggest plans he's making or patterns for toys. I wanted to suggest lamplight in this photo, and I think it is achieved, but with a full-size lamp, whereas if I'd had a 1/12 size lamp, it wouldn't have looked like the room was lamplit at all. It would have looked mainly dark with a tiny little pinprick of red or yellow light. And here are the shelves and dresser full of more toys in the front of the shop, and the 2 bay windows. It was easy photographing the shop from the front, but it was difficult photographing it from the inside looking out because there was no removable wall in this house. And plus, even if I did manage to put the camera through the lean-to, so I was looking through the doorway of the lean-to into the shop, the bay windows were never meant to fit onto the front of this building, and so there was always an enormous gap, and the room was always too dark. And I couldn't have light coming in from this angle at the front, because then I couldn't photograph it, because I would be photographing straight into the light source. One way around it was to leave one bay window out and put my hand and the camera in through the space where the window stood, and this did provide some variation of viewpoint. Here I'm trying to capture moonlight in the shop, and here's the shop transformed into Mr. Trushenko's living space, the dresser once again, and the same living room at the end of the story. You can see the square hole in the ceiling where the stairs were. One of the most exciting parts of photographing Mr. Trushenko's story was that I could use such a wide variety of little people. I don't think it mattered if they seemed to come from different time periods, or some were kind of fairy folk and some were more realistic. I think they just all looked like an interesting mixture of characters, and for a children's story I don't think it really mattered, so I could use a real colourful and idiosyncratic range. Because I needed customers to visit his toy shop, I had to create some new characters, in the sense that excuse me, whereas it would be too much work to create adults again, I modified some of the children I had so that they would seem like the children of these characters. For instance, I had this king, and so I took Miss Mary Banks and gave her a little cape and a crownlet. Is that a word? Crownlet? To make her seem like a princess. I took a little blonde boy and gave him a hat the same as the wizard's hat to make him look like the wizard's son. I took Josie, the eldest Duckworth girl, and gave her a witch's hat and outfit so that she would seem like the witch's little girl. And a sultan, this figure here on the right, I took, I can't actually remember how I got this. Oh, I think I took one of the spearheads that I'd been using for Greta in Greta the Great, and painted her skin the same colour as the Sultan's and gave her different colour hair and a new outfit. And there you can see the room in all its chaos as I'm in the middle of filming Mr. Trushenko the toy shop and Mr. Trushenko's toy shop. That's Greta's farm, the Swedish farm there. It was very difficult moving around and not crushing everything as well. At various stages in Mr. Trushenko the Toy Maker, various expressions on the faces of the townspeople were called for, so I divided as many as were relevant of the little people into groups, i.e. astonished or scornful, jeering, whispering, kind and friendly, neutral. I also needed a group of unusual customers, of background figures, of regular figures, such as the drunk sailor sitting propped up against a barrel in the same spot even during the snowy scenes. And the man who runs the market stall just around the corner from Mr. Tushenko's toy shop. I needed children who appeared twice. I needed children who were hostile then friendly, children who appeared once, children jeering, pointing, smiling, inside the shop and outside, looking in the windows and just passing by in the street. And these are the piles of figures I've got on the floor here. The outhouse from Great Aunt Rose's backyard can be seen in the left-hand foreground, which I used as a public toilet for the park. But then I thought, no, that was a bridge too far, because the little high street did seem too old-fashioned for a public toilet such as that. Because every scene for every story took several hours to arrange and used so many tiny objects in order to maintain order, I really should have cleared up after each scene, but since cleaning up and ordering everything took almost as long as arranging the scene in the first place, often I didn't. Here is the story when the lights went out, or rather behind the scenes of that story. A story about a girl's day at her Great Aunt Rose's house when the electricity goes off. And it was very important to me from the start to capture the authentic rainy day light, which I did by placing the house on a chest of drawers level with a windowsill in a bedroom and waiting for a rainy day. I did this because the other ways I tried to achieve a rainy day light effect had failed. For instance, I tried photographing the doll's house in a room with the curtains drawn. If I didn't draw the curtains, there were reflections of the doll's house windows there were reflections in the doll's house windows of the real windows that were opposite the doll's house. But with curtains drawn, the set was too dark. These are the puddles used in Little Pixie's Rainy Day. And the mirror board they're made out of is quite visible, unfortunately. It's very thick. There's Lucy peering out of the window. So then I tried photographing the house with the curtains open, and that was too bright. So then I draped the window in a thin cotton sheet, and the reflection of it can be seen in the upstairs doll's house window, which I hope looks like curtains. And that was the closest I got to rainy day light. Then I spritzed the house with water from a plant spray, as I spritzed Little Pixie's treehouse in his story Where It Rains as well. And I had to dry the water off immediately after I'd spritzed it on. And as it was, the front door stopped opening and shutting properly because of the damp, and the windows came unstuck from the front of the house. Also, the water droplets are very much too big for 1/12 scale, but for 1/12 scale raindrops, but there was no real way around that, because the vapour from the spray turned almost immediately into bigger droplets all on its own. Also, the 1/12 scale lights in the doll's house were far too orange, but I couldn't do much about it. Not being able to remove walls from the room, I needed to photograph and put a real lamp in, which I could do in things like Greta the Great, because there was no back on the house. Though the rags I wrapped around the lamp to dim it began to smoulder a bit. In this instance, I wanted the viewer to be able to see into the room as much as possible, but it wasn't that successful. Much more successful were photographs inside the room looking out, and I'd asked for this wall of the doll's house to be removable so that I could easily photograph inside the room. This was on a real rainy day outside, and it was bright enough to see everything inside the room clearly and dim enough so that the doll's house light still showed up. Everything in this house I tried to make as authentically pre-Second World War as possible. So I built a utilitarian cupboard in the kitchen and the drop leaf table here from Kits, and there are old-fashioned light switches and this little kit fire, plug-in fire. I did make a 40s mottled green tile fireplace in the hearth to the right as you're looking at the room, but it never appeared in any of the photos. There was never a reason to photograph, a sort of narrative reason to photograph the room looking towards this wall. The same room appears in Grandma's piano when Alice has piano lessons with Mr. Shang. Here's the hallway. Lucy's red raincoat and Wellingtons. Frog Wellingtons, I love those little things. I bought those in a doll's house shop, probably Kristen Babois. And this pink coat behind, which is meant to be Great Aunt Rosa's coat, is actually the headless body of Mrs. Pugh. Because lots of the heads of my models are detachable, it's really quite easy to remove the head sometimes if I want to suggest an outfit, which I did here. Poor Mrs. Pugh. I couldn't persuade her to part with the coat, so she had to be made to part with her head. This is Aunt Rose's backyard. These climbing beans were pieces of string, were cress, watercress basically, glued to a toothpick frame, and they wilted very, very quickly, so I had to take the photo and get on with it and not hang around for this shot. The inside of the outhouse is decorated too in blue and white wallpaper to look like tiles, and it has a little ancient toilet with a chain flush and dark green tin toilet roll holder. And then there's a wooden coal bunker in here filled with real coal and shelves with tins of paint and brushes, hammers, rolls of paper, etc. Here's the same rainy day light coming into Great Aunt Rosa's kitchen and living room. And I always kick myself when I see that I didn't make the rug lie flat. It immediately gives the game away that this is a doll's house in 1/12 scale when something like that happens. But it's impossible to remember all these details. For instance, later you'll see that a picture is skew or I don't know, something else ludicrous has happened, like a curtain is sticking up, but it is kind of impossible to, it's kind of impossible to remember everything always, all of the time. Now you can see the rainy day light at the back because I turned the doll's house around to face the window, so that the back of the doll's house was facing the window, but I still needed some light in the room. So sometimes the light doesn't really make sense, but I just hope the reader doesn't think too much into it. And there's an instance of what I was just talking about, a picture sticking out from the wall. Another shot, which is technically all wrong. You can see the lamp I'm using in the reflection of the back window where there should only be darkness and droplets of rain, and the oil lamp's not throwing any of the shadows it should, but the overall effect is hopefully one of lamplight, intimacy, and nighttime outside. And the good thing is that children don't worry about this sort of technical thing anyway. There's the utilitarian cupboard I made from the kit in the background. This kitchen range was also in the kitchen of the modern house in the stories When when the moon went out on Grandma's piano. And there's real sugar in that little bowl. Again, you don't see the fireplace here because I had to remove the wall in order to put a lamp here to suggest firelight falling on their faces. And here Aunt Rose is showing Lucy how to light a match, which was a bit controversial. I didn't realise when I wrote it into the story, but then an editor said it was a bit controversial. I decided to keep it, but it was in fact impossible to get Lucy to hold a match because I'd modelled her hands like this, not like that. So all I could do was glue a tiny hair thin piece of wood to the tip of her finger, and it looked so awful that in the end I just cut it off and hoped that it was suggestive of her lighting a fire. They're making a shadow show. And technically there shouldn't be any light outside the window at all now, because this takes place in the story after the photo above where it's night outside. But again, hopefully no one notices these details. Well, you do now I've told you about them. And then we move on to behind the scenes of the scrapwork field. And as I mentioned when I was talking about the picture book, sorry, the mock-up book, I took these photographs in the New Forest, or very close to the New Forest. And I wanted to capture the exhilarating feeling of early to midsummer. There's a very beautiful lane leading to a field. And these were my original models for the story, a lovely neighbour and her little daughter. But after a while I gave up on drawing real people, and these are just photographs from I was going to use for the original pictures. One of the problems we had with this little girl was that she, in the story, Jess loves the countryside and loves the field, but this little girl, our neighbour, hated everything to do with the countryside. So she hated grass, she hated insects, and she had to be carried pretty much all the time because she was not enjoying it at all. I had similar trouble with the child I used initially for the model for Greta the Great, who in the story loves animals, but the child in real life hated them. So we took them to a petting zoo in order to get a photograph of her feeding geese or a pig or riding horse, but we could hardly get them within 10 feet of any of the animals. It was a great relief to work with models in the end. Here is Sylvie making the scrapwork field that we see at the end of the book for Jess. And I used the real scraps from the real little field to litter her table here, so the fabrics would correspond. And as I mentioned before, Jess is Meg Duckworth. I really love this room of Sylvie's. This is actually the whole of the downstairs of the little white stone cottage. And my goodness, if I could live somewhere, I think out of all the rooms in all the of my houses, my model houses, although it's a really tough call because I love so many of them so much, I think this is the one I love the most. You can see some of the alternate heads I used for Jess here. I would detach one and put another one on her body. When I had this doll's house built, I asked if the walls could be double thickness so the windows would be very deep set as they are in cottages. I was just experimenting with light, trying to get the right look for them having their tea. And it was September when I was photographing this, so I had to wait for sunny days. In the end, I gave up. This was the first story I tried to photograph illustrations for, and I soon realised I couldn't wait for the weather. You know, I couldn't wait for wet, rainy days or sunny days, so I brought everything inside and found that artificial light made a perfectly good substitute for sunlight. And this is the set. So this is the house from the scrapbook field where Sylvie lives, and these little tiny branches wilted in a few days after we picked them. They were real branches. They're held up by little curls of wire which I photoshopped out afterwards, and so I had to take the photos within hours of us, my mum and I, picking these branches. And if you notice this little beehive in the garden, it's fallen over. Something like that can potentially spoil this whole set, which would take about a day to arrange. Real tiny miniature ferns, you know, like the baby bits of fern in the walls. Real, my mum and I made real stone walling. Fake grass, the same horses from Greta the Great. This is another view. You can see the stone walls up a little bit more closely here. The stones we got in bags of stones they sell in aquariums. It was really hard to find pebble-like stones the right size because real pebbles were too small for this type of wall, and the little stones were set in good old polyfiller. The first walls broke when they dried, so my mum and I had the idea of putting wire armature in the centre of the wall, and though the walls with the armature still cracked in a few places and were incredibly heavy, they stayed in one piece, and I hid the cracks with little ferns and bracken. This is a shot of Sylvie's garden from above. The apple trees in her garden were taken from the same mountain tree that supplied the foliage for Greta the Great. And even in this photo, taken only 1 hour after I picked them, you can see they're beginning to wilt already. I stuck tiny berries on at intervals to mimic apples. The well in the bottom left of the picture reappears in several other stories, but it was made for this one to go with Sylvie's cottage, with the little slate roof and the stone wall. Backdrops were always a problem. When I tried to superimpose the scene on a backdrops were always a problem. When I tried to superimpose the scene on a photographed real backdrop of scenery, it never looked right, and creating the hills and fields, etc. in Photoshop looked terrible, so I had to do without. Here's Sylvie's cottage again as the Three Bears home in Where's My Story, and here is the well, and here are the walls again. You can see the walls quite clearly here, and the chicken coop before it was painted red and blue. Sadly, though, it was a lot easier using models than real people. When it came to photographing the field, there was nothing I could do to replicate the wonder of a real field in full summer sunlight. Lamplight and models just don't cut the mustard. For a start, I simply didn't have enough space to make it. I needed a barn or a warehouse or an air hanger. Worrying echoes of Synecdoche, New York began going through my head. and I couldn't afford any more fake grass. This bit cost about, I don't know, I can't quite remember. I think it was over £100. So I had to segmentalise the field and Sylvie and Jess's activities there. Here they're flying the kite from the hill. This was a difficult part to photograph because I wanted it to look like twilight, and tried lots of different lights in lots of different places from lots of different angles to get it. There's the fox. It was also difficult because I had to get close to take the photo, but when I did, or when I changed my position, everything fell over. You can't stand anything on fake grass, nor can you stick anything down or sew anything or pin it. The stuff is kind of impenetrable. I don't know how I balanced that tree actually. I often did it by wedging the trunk in the open blades of pliers and then photoshopping it out, or sometimes even a knife or fork. I knew I should have a backdrop when taking scenes like this, but I was too tired to make any more sky at this point, and the projects were becoming a little bit too consuming. Because they were all happening simultaneously together. It wasn't as if I finished one and then went on to another. It made sense as I went along to, for instance, film scenes in which I needed to use a lot of foliage one day, and organising it all became quite a nightmare. The difficulties of trying to photograph a scene in low light can be seen here. All the way along during photographing these models, I needed lights that were subtler. Maybe there's specialist lighting equipment that's subtler than household bulbs, but if there is, I don't know of it. The last real challenge of photographing the scrapwork field was all to do with the car in which Mum appears at the end of the story to take Jess home. First of all, finding a 1/12 scale car that looked at all normal and not some sort of fancy model that Mum wouldn't be driving took quite a while. And when I found this tin Mini Cooper with the Union Jack on the roof, I had to paint out the Union Jack. And then, while it didn't have glass in the windows, so although the doors didn't open, I could, with a bit of difficulty, slot the figures through the windows and pose them inside. It did have really low ceilings, though, and it was very dark when I tried to photograph inside. And then there was the problem of, if I focused on Sylvie getting smaller through the window, I lost focus on Jess, and if I focused on Jess, I lost focus on Sylvie. If I was drawing the illustrations at this stage, I wouldn't have had any of these problems, I don't think, but I'd chosen to use 1/12 scale models, so I had to somehow make it work. There was also no way of getting Jess to spread out the whole scrapwork field in the back of the car because there just wasn't space. And then I didn't know how to show the grin on her face, the pleasure at rolling out this really special present Sylvie has given her, this memento of their time together, and simultaneously show the field. So in the end I had to compromise with a side view. Now we come on to a story called Greta the Great. This is the little mock-up book I made of it to send to publishers. And I do have the main character here in London with me, which is little Greta. She's very small, as you can see. I think she still is wearing the same apron she was wearing when I photographed her for this book, and it's looking pretty grimy and threadbare. There's also a little old lady I made for the story. I think I had her as Greta's grandmother in the story. Great-grandmother Gudrun or something, I think I called her. This is an aerial view of Greta's farmhouse, another doll's house I had made by the same people. I made the wood saw, the well, there's the same well, all of the fences, the tree seat, where's that gone? I can't find that at the moment. and the tea table. There's a little tea table under that tree. And I made the lean-to on the woodshed, which is the garden shed from the night the moon went out and Grandma's piano painted red and white. And then I put sea moss and bracken around the bases of the fences. I used blue plastic for the stream, fake grass, a lot of chippings, and real branches of trees again. There was only one type of, oh, there's this little tree seat around the base of the tree that I made, and the little table. I discovered there was only one type of tree that I could take branches from to use that had leaves that were small enough to be plausible for this scale. And I feel bad about it now, but at the time I quite diminished this one tree on the mountain close to where my mum and dad lived, because I went back again and again for so many little branches. This was my lighting arrangement often for these stories. 2 or 3 lamps suspended from the ceiling. Not that safe, but quite effective. And I used to put black, very thick plastic underneath everything, like kind of tarpaulin. And first of all, before I laid it all out, I would chalk up a map of where I wanted the set to go and work out the sizes of everything. And there is Greta's farm in the snow, and you get a little idea of the chaos. And there's my feet. Cotton wool, pipe cleaners, and viscose fleece for the snow, which all unfortunately had slightly different colours. The cotton wool is a bit of a yellower white than the white fleece. None of them worked for covering the branches and leaves, so I mentioned, as I mentioned in another video, I sprinkled flour over them and talcum powder, and it went through the louvered doors into the wardrobe, and those were the louvered doors. And my mum was not best pleased. Later, when I was photoshopping blue around countless tiny branches at the edges, I wished I'd just bought more card and painted it blue and made more sky so that I wouldn't have to Photoshop around it. There's Greta's dad feeding the horse. I wanted it to be low light because I wanted it to appear to be night, but in actual fact it looked too light for night. I thought I could darken the exposure in Photoshop later on. In the end, I found twilight coming into the bedroom was the best light to photograph the external snow scenes in, because the twilight was cool but not so dark that the lights inside the house didn't show up. I could wait for the perfect time of day with which to photograph these twilight scenes. Now we see various attempts to photograph the family having dinner lit solely by the oil lamp in order to illustrate the darkness that creeps into the house on the long winter Scandinavian nights, but the oil light didn't really light the room enough. Doll's house lights don't give as much light as they should, probably because they get too hot and corrode the wires. So I had to light the room gently and from a real lamp outside, and then that was still dim enough to let the tiny 112 light show, and then do some photoshopping afterwards. I really love this room as well. trying to focus through the window on the family inside, the window becomes completely blurred. In an ideal world or in a drawn illustration, I could make both in focus. This is Greta's bedroom. Her bed's the one piece of furniture I made. I wanted a tiny bed, and it was just easier to make one rather than shop around to try and get a tiny one. I find making furniture actually very, very difficult, very different to making people or fabric things or toys or food, and I do not enjoy the carpentry side of things, so I was glad that there was only that one thing that I couldn't source. Greta's bedroom also was the hospital room in Mr. Tushenko the Toy Maker. Again, difficulties of photographing in the near dark because the figures don't show up well and pixelation is blurred. And the light you use to illuminate the figure looks like a searchlight when in fact you want a more diffuse light. And the light you use to simulate the moon also looks like a spotlight because this is a lamp outside the window. And you have to put it low enough outside the window so that it shines in and gives enough light in the room, but real moonlight comes from higher up, obviously in the sky. This is looking from Greta's bedroom across the hall to the kitchen living room. In the story, I had to pretend these two rooms were quite far apart at opposite ends of the house in order for Greta to have a long and frightening journey to the kitchen in the night. You can see how close the rooms really were by looking at the back of the doll's house here. That's Greta's bedroom, that's the hallway, and that's the kitchen. And this is Mama and Papa's room. I think the loveliest room in the house, which unfortunately you don't get to see much of in the book. And again, with this doll's house, I had walls slide away. So this whole side wall slid away so I could get views of Greta's bedroom looking towards the door, and Mama and Papa's room, which is just along, which is sort of across and on the front wall of the house. I could also look into that way and access that way. I love the wallpaper in this room. And then we have reached, I'm sure you'll be glad to know, the end of this behind the scenes video, except for one thing. Not a house that's appeared in any of the stories so far, but a room of a house I hope will appear in stories about the Duckworths. It's Luke the lighthouse keeper's cottage kitchen room, and it's the only room I've made so far for the Duckworth stories. This is just made out of a cardboard box. This is a fake door pressed into the wall. I just had a little plastic spare bay window which I put here. Piece of wood for the beam, the last bit of tiling, floor tiling sheet that I had after tiling the burrow. I plastered the inside of the box with polyfiller as well. It makes great whitewash, the illusion of whitewash, and there's a little black cast iron stove in that grate that I put together from a kit. And there's real porridge in the pot. So there, thank you so much for watching this very, very lengthy video. I'm now going to go to bed. It's several hours. It's several hours after I began, and hopefully you found this as consuming as I found it when I was making the whole set.